Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. I'm happy to welcome Benjamin Studebaker back to Wider View. Benjamin is an American doing a PhD in politics and international studies at the University of Cambridge. His research focuses on economic inequality and democratic theory. He blogs at benjaminstudebaker.com. I thought we would start with the race for the Democratic nomination. We've had two debates now, each of them just a full platform of contenders. All of them seem to agree on only one thing, and that is that they want to beat Donald Trump. Which of them, if any, do you think can do that?
Well, I think Sanders stands a chance of doing it because Sanders attempts to speak to all of the traditional constituencies of the Democratic Party, including the working class and the underclass. And I think that most of them talk mainly to the professional class, to people with college educations. And that has traction early in a Democratic primary where most of the polling is determined by who's got the edge in media, which is primarily consumed by educated people. But I don't think that early performance with that constituency is a good representation of who's likely to win a general election with a much broader electorate.
I thought that Elizabeth Warren, at least in this debate this last week, did well, but basically by sort of tying herself to Sanders. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's difficult because with the way that the debates are formatted, you get a debate where there's Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and then they're surrounded by half a dozen centrist Democrats who poll at less than 1%. I think it was 5 or 6 in total who poll at less than 1%, and that 5 or 6 had 50 minutes combined to talk during that debate. And Sanders and Warren each got about 18 minutes apiece. So when that happens, there's no opportunity for Warren and Sanders to argue with each other or distinguish their positions from one another. They spend the whole debate arguing with centrist Democrats who are arguing mainly Republican talking points. So there's no opportunity to get any kind of progressive debate. I think we would benefit from a debate in which Sanders and Warren just went head to head and clarified the areas where they agree and the areas where they disagree, because I don't think we're going to get that in these huge formats where the debate just becomes a large number of candidates who stand no chance of winning versus them. But I think it certainly has the effect of keeping the argument superficial and preventing us from getting into a deeper or higher level argument, because we just keep getting caught up with these red herrings where Medicare for All gets compared to various kinds of communist plots. We can't get anywhere when that's the level of discourse. So in the next debate, I think the rule is that you have to have at least 2% in several different polls, either national or early state, and that will get the numbers down a bit.
Let's turn on to an article you wrote about how the Democratic Party can't really redo the Clinton campaign if they're going to try to win. Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think over the last few years, there's been a lot of fear narrative in the Democratic Party. There's been a lot of fear discourses around Nazis, around Russians, and I think the Democrats have tried to make people afraid of Donald Trump and make people view Donald Trump as the bad guy. And I think that was basically Hillary Clinton's strategy, especially in the last 2 months. It was to paint Donald Trump as the bad guy, as this deplorable person, and to try to morally shame people into voting Democratic without necessarily promising them a lot of discrete benefits. And so you have a lot of Democrats now who aren't really offering you very much in the way of policy that will make your life better, but they're saying if you don't support them, you're a bad person. And I think that kind of entitled attitude is not going to help us win. It seems that Trump is, I think, as you said recently, Trump is not scared of those tactics. He plays off them. When his supporters are called racist and bigots and sexist, seems to increase his popularity. Yeah, the Republicans like to paint the Democratic Party as the party of the elite and the party of educated people who think that you're uneducated and stupid and don't care about you. And when we are derisive toward people in the middle of the country and we don't treat them with respect, that plays into that narrative that the Democratic Party is an elite party, when of course, really, it's the Republican Party that most focuses on the economic interests of the economic elite.
I see that many people are really frustrated by the political system and that its failure to make life better for most of us. And a lot of people are retreating from the system altogether, and others, as you say, are, quote, pretending to do politics when they do not, in fact, produce any meaningful change. Maybe you can talk about some of those things people are doing.
Yeah. So in that particular piece, I was talking about a few different things people do to try to protect themselves and their own happiness from a political system that's very demoralizing and very dispiriting. And so one of those, I think, is a kind of retreat into self-help, self-care, focus on taking care of yourself and the people immediately around you because you don't feel like you can contend with the system. Kind of focus on localism and on community that comes out of that, which is a kind of form of building a fortress around yourself, around the people that you know personally. A second one is a kind of emphasis on technology as a savior force, hoping that technology will produce some kind of transformation in conditions that will take care of these political questions for us so that we don't have to worry about them. Another one is a kind of consumer politics, and this is similar to that emphasis on localism and what's immediately around you, to make different decisions in your own life that would align with the kind of world that you want without engaging with the institutions that might compel other people to follow suit. So you end up doing something that, well, it might make a difference if everyone were doing it, because it's not being imposed by institutions on everyone. Only a relatively small number of people end up doing it. And so it doesn't have anywhere near the impact that it would need to have to actually solve the problem.
Maybe you can provide some examples on that one.
Yeah. So, for instance, there's a lot of people who on climate change will change their diet. They'll change the way that they get around. They'll make changes to their house to make their house more sustainable or more fuel efficient. And that feels good. It feels like you're doing something. But when you look at the statistics, American emissions are 15% of the global total. And if you look even within that, the bulk of US emissions are produced by corporations and by power generation, by coal power plants, oil power plants. These are things that are not something that we can access through residential, individual, independent decisions. And so if we settle for that, then there's a very large amount of emissions that we're never going to touch. There's a graduate student from Finland I was speaking to recently who said that all of the things that people ordinarily talk about, your personal transport, what you eat, all of the things that you have power over in your life, amount to only about 20% of the emissions in a rich state. So if you add up all the rich states together, they account for about a third of the world's emissions. And then if you add up all of the emissions that you might personally have control over, even assuming that you could get everyone else to behave the way you behave, you're talking about 20% of that third. So we're talking about 5 or 6% of global emissions that are something that individuals could collectively do something about if everybody were doing it. And of course, everybody doesn't do it. And then the amount of cut we need to make in emissions is much greater than 5 or 6%.
But the advantage of that approach, and of all the approaches that you mentioned, and we have a couple more to talk about, but is that it's possible to actually achieve something. You can feel good about yourself. You can feel as though you've done something.
Yeah, and that's the self-care element that's running through a lot of this. A lot of people have started to focus on how can they feel okay about a world that is really disappointing and seems to be falling apart. And rather than take action that prevents the world from falling apart, they instead settle for taking action that makes themselves feel better about a world that's falling apart. It becomes about happiness rather than about achieving a social good.
Right. And I want to get back to that point, but I think we should go ahead and mention the other of your 5 things, the discursive movements and the fandoms. Maybe you can explain those two as well.
Yeah. The discursive movements are similar to consumer movements, but where in a consumer movement, you're changing what you buy, what you purchase. In a discursive movement, you're changing the words that you use, how you talk. And I think that lately, a lot of people have overestimated the significance of words that individuals use and ascribe to them greater effects on politics than are really merited. And I
Mm-hmm.
especially see that from younger people who are accustomed to doing politics on the internet, where the bulk of what you're able to do is language and talking. And at some point or another, what makes the internet promising is that at some point or another, that conversation is supposed to translate into organizational action that's about winning power in political institutions. And if it doesn't translate to that, then it's just language. It doesn't go anywhere. That's the kind of gear shift that has to be made. And I'm not sure it's being made. And in some ways, I see people who looked like they were engaging more with institutions falling back on language
Mm-hmm.
and retreating back into language, especially within the progressive left.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the last one is fandoms. And this is another way of just kind of getting away from politics altogether. There's a lot of people I see who get very attached to some kind of artistic movement, to a film franchise, to TV shows, things like that, instead of to politics or morality or religion, because those ideologies to them seem to make impossible demands or to not go anywhere in particular.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead, they make friends and they bond with people over TV and movies, in much the same way that a lot of teenagers do. And teenagers make friend groups based around everybody wearing the same clothes or liking the same kind of music. I'm seeing people who are adults, especially in their 20s and 30s, doing versions of that, iterations of that, in lieu of doing politics.
The common thread here is that people want to do something. They want to effect a change, and they end up only changing themselves or maybe the people immediately around them. But the reason that things get diverted there is because they don't see a way to engage in politics that is productive and useful, that will affect the sort of change that they want to make. So what would you suggest that people do instead of all of these things, if they wanted to get involved in politics but really want change?
One thing is that you have to be okay with the possibility that there will often be setbacks and it will often be disappointing. And I think a lot of people are looking to be happy from their politics. And
Right.
politics isn't necessarily a place you go to feel happy. Politics is often going to be disappointing and dispiriting, especially when you're engaging with very powerful actors and institutions that oppose you. And so you have to have sources of happiness that are outside your political action, so that when
Mm-hmm.
you come to politics, you don't make the politics about yourself, you make it about your strategic goals. And those strategic goals have to be oriented toward winning power within institutions, even if that requires you to work with people that you don't personally like, even if that requires you to sometimes talk in ways that you would prefer not to talk.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be strategic, even if it means that you're not always comfortable or you're not always able to live in a way that feels fully authentic or
Mm-hmm.
fully enriching. And that's the difficult thing about politics, and it's why it's something that most people have a bit of a intuitive aversion to, because it is a realm where you can't necessarily always be yourself, can't always self-actualize.
And I think a lot of progressives tend to criticize Democrats because so many of them are trying to make a strategic decision about, for example, who to vote for in the Democratic primary. Who is, the key question becomes who is most likely to win against Trump, rather than which one of these people, if they won, would actually be able to lead the country in a positive direction. And I think a lot of people on the left are unhappy with that choice.
Yeah, and it's easy to go too far in the other direction and say, well, I only think that someone can win who resembles people who have won in the past, and therefore to restrict very heavily your sense of options. And I think that there's a kind of middle route. Max Weber, the political theorist, said that to do politics, you have to have two different ethics that you combine together. One is an ethic of conviction, which is caring about something, wanting to make the world a better place, and having real values that you care about. And another is an ethic of responsibility, which is doing things that enable you to hold power and stay in power. Because if you don't have that, then you can't accomplish the convictions. But conversely, if you don't have the convictions, then there's no purpose to being in power in the first place. And so these things have to be combined together. And it's an uneasy thing because they pull against each other a bit.
Right.
And I don't think that it can straightforwardly be said that there's one precise, correct combination for all situations. But it's something we always have to be trying to do. We always have to try to find the right combination of those two principles.
You're listening to a conversation with Benjamin Studebaker, political science at Cambridge University in the UK. This is Wider View Radio. Another criticism that I have heard many times from progressives is that the social movements that we have had, particularly over the last several years, have not really lived up to the promise or the ideals of the founders. I'm thinking of things like Occupy and Black Lives Matter, Me Too, the environmental movement, so forth. And a lot of people say that what's happened with these movements is that they get co-opted by the Democratic Party and transformed into get out the vote efforts for candidates that don't really share the ideals or the goals of the original movement. Now, would you agree with that? And do you think there is another way, popular movements like this can be more productive?
Well, I think part of the trouble is that a lot of these movements have focused on popularizing different kinds of language, and they haven't been as focused on getting discrete material results. So what happens is that the language that they're using, Democrats learn to speak that language. They learn to use the terms the way that the activists are using the terms, and that makes the activists feel like they've moved on the substance, when really they haven't moved on the substance. And so we see a lot of stuff like Medicare for All. Initially, a lot of Democrats say, oh, yes, we're for Medicare for all, and the media reports that the party's moved to the left on healthcare. And then you start to hear people go, well, I'm for Medicare for all who want it. And, oh, I think there are many paths to Medicare for all. And suddenly Medicare for all means the public option. And then before you know it, there's half a dozen candidates on the stage who are expressly arguing against Medicare for all and calling it some kind of socialist plot. So you think that they've moved, but really what has happened is they've learned to speak your language, and then they gradually twist the terms until they mean what all of the language originally meant. And so there has to be something more grounded than just discourse.
The environmental movement is one that, for me, has been a big disappointment in that, I see so much activity around the environment and so much legitimate concern, but nothing seems to move forward in the political space that seems to match the rhetoric that we're hearing from the activists in that area. Is there a way that a movement like this should operate vis-a-vis the political system that it's not doing?
Yeah, you hear a slogan like Green New Deal and you go, oh, is this something new? Are we doing something more radical? And you go, well, what's the content of it? What's the substantive content? And what you find out is that it's the infrastructure spending bill everybody's been talking about forever. But now there's green attached to it so that it is easier to sell to people as a necessary expenditure. And I think that that's the problem. When we focus on popularizing new sets of words, then we don't manage to actually get the substance of the policy. And it's hard because we think when people say they're for the words, that means they're for the policy. And I think the only way that you can really tell the difference is to look into people's past, see what people have a history of doing, and don't necessarily trust that when someone says that they support a slogan, that that really means that they support the policy. The other thing I think that we need to see is the building of organizations that can provide donor bases that enable people to compete with the candidates who continue to receive money from wealthy interest groups. Because a lot of these candidates are still receiving money from these industries while they're claiming that they support these new sets of language.
Yeah, and they're only, I think, in the recent, with a recent few elections, have we seen candidates be fairly successful raising money only from small donors. That's a fairly new thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's difficult to replicate at scale because you have to get a lot of ordinary people motivated. And a lot of candidates aren't able to do that. And when they're not able to do that, they fall back on donors. So for instance, in the case of Elizabeth Warren, her campaign had very weak initial fundraising figures. And so what they did is they raided the Senate campaign stash that Warren had. Mm-hmm. Of course, the Senate campaign stash had money that came from corporate interest groups. But because the presidential campaign hasn't directly taken money from corporate interest groups, the Warren campaign claims that its money mainly comes from clean sources. But what really happened is that they took a lot of money from the Senate campaign, and that money is from all sorts of different places. And so we really have to keep an eye out because oftentimes people do play games.
They really do. Yeah, one other thing I want to touch on briefly, and I think we've skirted this issue a few times in talking about language, is the whole matter of identity politics. Identity politics seems to be very important to the Democrats within the party, but seems also to have something of a negative effect outside the party. And would you agree with that? And then how do you think that issue can be resolved?
Well, the way that I think about it is if you think about what is the origin of race in contemporary politics, what's its original purpose? Its original purpose is that the Republican Party made the argument that democratic welfare programs were programs that favored African Americans at the expense of white people. And they used that racialized lens to make white people less interested in supporting those welfare programs over time, referring to the people who accepted them as welfare queens, implying that they were all African Americans living in inner cities. And so that rhetoric, when it's deployed, is used to diminish solidarity among working class groups of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And so when Democrats try to wield that language to their benefit, I think they end up reinforcing that division and that alienation unintentionally. And that makes it harder to build and fuse together that coalition. And Democrats go, well, come on, poor and working class white people can't really believe that we don't care about them and we only care about African Americans when we use a slogan like Black Lives Matter. But that's what Republicans have been saying. Republicans say that slogans like that mean that the Democratic Party doesn't care about you, that it's an elite project. And so I think that it is politically damaging, especially in states that have very large white populations. And I also, from what I've seen, a lot of the language that appears attractive to educated professional class activists on identity doesn't poll as well with working class people, even from backgrounds of color. So, for instance, if you look at the abolish ICE, abolish the police, those slogans, and you ask ordinary African-American voters or ordinary Latino voters about those slogans, they don't poll particularly well. And so I think there's a little bit of a discursive bubble going on where among a group of well-educated, reasonably affluent Democrats, this stuff looks appealing, but it doesn't poll nearly as well outside of those enclaves.
Thank you. I think that's quite helpful. One of the things I think I want to sort of close with is your take on what it is for those of us who have a progressive political outlook in this country. What do you think needs to be done to get us as far as we are able to get in the political system through this 2020 election?
Well, I think that the Sanders campaign has got the best chance of getting more people involved in places where the Democratic Party has not been able to go, because Sanders has uh, traditionally been most popular in Midwestern states, in Plains states, Rocky Mountain states, places where Democrats have struggled, and particularly in rural and suburban areas. And so I think that there's some potential there in creating a message that can travel a little bit more widely than the traditional Democratic Party message. But moreover, beyond that, I think that
It does seem too that would be a way to get more progressives into the House and Senate, perhaps as well.
yeah,
Good.
because without the Senate, we really aren't going to be able to pass stuff. And so when I talk to people about the way Hillary campaigned, people go, well, she won the popular vote. I go, well, okay, suppose that she had won the presidency. The situation in the Senate would not have allowed her to do very much. And so even if you're convinced that someone like Hillary Clinton would have made a good president, that strategy is not able to consistently win Democrats a large enough number of senators. Barack Obama, after the first 2 years, could not win enough senators to do very much at all. And so we need a strategy which doesn't just enable us to sometimes win the presidency, but one which enables us to win large numbers of senators. And that means competing for Senate seats in the middle of the country in places that are really different from college towns and cities.
I'm going to have to wind it up pretty soon here. Is there anything else that you'd like to say that we haven't touched on?
Well, I think that as things are moving along, there will be some field clearing that goes on in the Democratic primaries. And I'm hopeful that there will be more opportunities for the differences among the candidates who are put into that progressive box to be engaged, because I think there are much bigger differences than the press tends to highlight. In part because I think the press, a lot of people in the press support candidates who are somewhere in between Sanders and Biden. I think they're very attracted to Warren and Harris, and they don't tend to highlight the ways in which those candidates differ from both Biden and Sanders. They tend to put them in the Sanders box. And so I'd like to see those differences get engaged more.
Good. Well, I hope they are over the time of the campaign. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, Benjamin, for taking time with me, and I do appreciate your insights on politics here. So, thank you again for joining me.
Thanks for having me on. It was great, as always.
Okay. Take care. That was political scientist Benjamin Studebaker speaking to me from his home in Cambridge, in UK. And this is Wider View. The views expressed on Wider View are those of myself and my guests and may not reflect the views of the management of the radio station that you're listening to. Our aim is to provoke you to think outside the box and question the narratives you hear from the mainstream media and our national leaders. I hope we've succeeded. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.